You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Get bellyache. I got a duty right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always is Lord Uther, and the man with all the right moves joining us today, Steph Georgievich. Depending on what part of the Balkans you're from, welcome, sir, welcome.
Thank you.
Very glad to have you fellas here early on a Sunday morning. We are, of course, enjoying coffee and Trek, and if you like coffee, try the boss of them all since 1992, Boss Coffee from Suntory. For relaxing time, make it Suntory time. I'm not paid to say that. I just really enjoy Boss Coffee.
Hallelujah.
Well, this is our 37th episode, and I'm 36th episode?
36.
Whatever episode we're on. 36. And we were talking two delightfully different Star Trek episodes from the original series today. That, of course, being the aptly titled Shore Leave, and the very interesting, shall we say, swerve of a series in the Galileo 7. Not to be confused with Magnificent. How many Galileos are you going to ask for? So, as always here on the Warp Core Podcast, I'd like to remind you to subscribe here at Pending Rebrand to stay up to date with us. And if you love the backgrounds on these episodes, the deep dive into Hollywood history, join us for our recurring host, as today, Steph Georgievich is going to walk us through not only Shore Leave, but also the Galileo 7. Take it away.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you, all of you who are up and at 'em, as well as those just clambering out of bed. We are here. It's a big transition for Star Trek for us. We're going to leave the year 1966 by the time this episode ends, and we're going to be in 1967. So Happy New Year to Star Trek and our push forward. So we have the very last episode of 1966. December 29th, in fact, is when Shore Leave first aired on NBC stations. It was directed by Robert Spar. Once again, you can kind of make a template for what previous episodic television a lot of these first season directors had and the shows that they had been working on. He had done Bonanza, 77 Sunset Strip, Perry Mason, The Wild Wild West, Adam West's Batman, even Lassie. Here, girl, the barn's
Nice.
on fire. So again,
Timmy fell down a well?
what?
Which way did the Klingons go?
So again, someone who knows the vernacular, the terminology, the pacing, the scheduling of episodic television, and has dipped their toes in genre work and just more straight dramatic or comedic. You see that a lot in these first seasons or so forth. I mean, science fiction still is not like we would imagine today, where there were multiple candidates for this genre. Star Trek is, again, first of its class in this particular field, the trendsetter, the tip of the spear. So naturally, as we get further and further into the 60s and 70s and 80s and so forth, then you have people who are doing the X-Files and Sliders and Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, and all of those, coming into the franchise and delivering great work. It was written by Theodore Sturgeon, and I say written by Theodore Sturgeon, sounds a little fishy, because although he is credited on on this episode, as the writer, there's a pretty funny story about what happened, and I'm about to tell you that. But first, just to say that Sturgeon was primarily known as a science fiction author, much like Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson, who have been writing in that, in literary terms, literature, before they came to television. That's primarily what he's known for. And at one point, he was ranked. They took a survey of, author and their peers and so forth. At one point, he was ranked second, only to Robert Heinlein, of course, the classic science fiction creator of Starship Troopers and others. He was ranked.
I'm doing my part.
He was ranked second only to Robert Heinlein as far as pre-1965 science fiction authors. So basically, amongst his peers and the large audiences that were devouring post-World War II, Cold War science fiction, adventure, and fantasy, Sturgeon was kind of a big deal. So, naturally, Roddenberry and his team picked him to deliver an episode of Trek. Now, here's that funny backstory. Gene Roddenberry, getting this show on the air after the failed pilot of The Cage, reworking the show on the fly, fielding cast member inclusions and exclusions and trying to get the right balance. How human or non-human will Leonard Nimoy portray Spock? All of this. Plus, as we talked about last week with Balance of Terror, having production delays related to the special effects and having to jostle the schedule around at the last minute because episodes weren't ready to be turned in due to the special effects crunch, etc., etc. The long and short of it was Gene Roddenberry was told by both his wife and his doctor that he needed a vacation. So, in a bit of irony or well-timed universal humor, of course, he was told this as the episode Shore Leave was being developed. So he went off for some court-ordered R&R. Meanwhile, Theodore Sturgeon, who again, we must stress, was a literary author, not a television writer, he turned in his script and he leaned heavily, as you might imagine in the end of 1966, on fantastical and surreal elements. And I wish I could elaborate more on what exactly that original script looked like. But whatever it was, NBC was, and I quote, concerned. If you're familiar with
typical NBC, right?
Of course, the suits. So if you're familiar with the episode and the idea that the crew has found a amusement park styled planet where anything goes, and
oh my,
something that you just have to think about can suddenly manifest itself in a corporeal form, you can imagine how weird it got. Anyways, at this time also we should start talking about a young man at the time, Eugene L. Kuhn. Eugene, the L stands for Lee. He joined Star Trek right around this time as a showrunner to work with Roddenberry and as a writer. And as a showrunner whose name was not Gene Roddenberry, his job was primarily to polish the scripts that came in, make sure that they all, fit the canon of what was being established as Star Trek. You couldn't call a Klingon a Romulan or a phaser, a laser gun, or you had to clean up those little inconsistencies, as well as make sure that the cast was being handled and that Shatner was getting more lines than the rest of the crew, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that's the job of a writer, showrunner, producer. Anyways, Gene L. Kuhn, who will become a pivotal role going forward in Star Trek for the rest of its run, the original series run, he was not told that NBC had concerns, apparently. The memo, he didn't get that memo in 1966. They didn't blast out a group chat or email. So when he went to rewrite it, he went further. He actually emphasized the fantasy and surreal elements. And I wish I could tell you what that draft looked like. But safe to say that when Gene Roddenberry came back from his mandatory vacation. The way that it was described is, we have a problem because we have a script that the network hates that's supposed to go in front of the cameras literally the next day, and the guy that I just hired to help steer the ship made it worse. I mean, in the sense of how the network approached it. So, according to legend, because they shot this episode at an animal preserve in Southern California, which is why it has that sort of natural yet artificial flavor, as well as extensively Vasquez Rocks, which has been a classic Star Trek location for many, many moons. It's even stood in for the planet. It's even stood in for the planet Vulcan in the Kelvin timeline in 2009. You're familiar with the rock formations. You've seen them. You've seen them in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. If you shoot in Los Angeles in Southern California and you need the desert, or you need some kind of something to scale, a mountain, you usually end up at Vasquez Rocks, which are only about 15 minutes away from my current location. And so there were a lot of shots of the crew, a lot of shots, particularly of the captain, running around Vasquez Rocks on a hot afternoon, etc. But when they were in the animal preserve, apparently the legend is that Roddenberry frantically set up a chair, a table, and a typewriter underneath a shaded tree and started frantically retyping Gene L. Kuhn's script, sometimes literally for the scenes that were supposed to be going, that day or shortly thereafter. Again, we don't have Final Draft or Celtics screenwriting programs. We don't have find and replace. We're just banging it out on the old Corona. And again, just trying to keep up with the production schedule because you have a bunch of people standing around saying, "What are we shooting today, Gene?" And so that's obviously, the vacation is over, as the ads for Star Trek V proclaimed, and Gene had to dive in there. So this one was a very hectic behind the scenes in order to get the magic that you saw in front of them.
I wonder if that inspired a later television series with a certain gentleman at a typewriter next to a tree in a field, fervently typing away. But maybe that's just something completely different.
No idea what you're talking about.
Oh, I don't know. I have
that
this
reference. Google it and subscribe.
There you go. That's the context.
Yeah, because I need help. I have no idea what's going on. So
drop it in the comments for Lord Uther. You heard it here. I made a reference Lord Uther didn't understand.
Too bad Gene Roddenberry wasn't sitting there during Star Trek V with a typewriter rewriting that too. But that's a whole nother story that we could get into.
Beautiful.
Indeed. This episode's also noted, and we'll talk about this, for some of the unusual people who pop up, including a new yeoman. Say goodbye to Janice Rand. Say hello to Tanya Barrows, played by the lovely Miss Emily Banks. We had a guy who out-hammed the Irish Kevin Riley in Finnegan, and Bruce Mars is either responsible for that performance or deserves all the plaudits, depending on how you took his characterization. Oliver McGoffin was our caretaker, who shows up at the end to make it all feel better. And so those were the Miss Emily Banks was the new cast and the friendly face, and she had quite a bit to do in this episode, which kind of leads us to sort of our first thought here. This was an anything goes at the time, a dramatic sort of change of pace, and I say dramatic because the intent is often comedic, and you can tell right away when Kirk is getting a back massage on the bridge and thinks it's Spock, and it ends up being the aforementioned yeoman or one of the yeomans on the bridge, and the Kirk, thank you, yeoman, that'll be all. They wrote this intending to be funny, I guess, and what I mean by that is that there were punchlines designed to land comedically, versus things that sprang more organically from the material. And I'd call, let's go back to the Naked Time with Sulu and Spock, barking, "Get D'Artagnan out of here," at one point. I mean, comedy's interesting. Like you know it when you hear it and you see it, but there was a tendency I won't call it camp, but to kind of play to the grandstanding seats. And this was several moments in this show for the first time in its run where they were definitely sort of playing it a little more broadly. Like we want to land a joke, a punchline, a little giggles moment here. And a little of that can go a long way depending on your taste. I've always found that when you're sort of thirsty for a laugh, sometimes it doesn't quite have the same desired effect. And let's not say that it by any means detracts from the overall impression of the episode, but you start to notice it here. And that could have been because they were rushing through and trying to fix whatever NBC deemed too outlandish for consumption. But you go to a show like Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, a few years later with Gil Gerard, and I mean it's the wink wink sly dun dun dun. That show is particularly guilty of it. Glenn A. Larson, show's creator, and all of that. And like I say, this doesn't derail Shore Leave, but for the first time you kind of see the writers deliberately doing like setups and punchlines, and that's
Little ham.
yeah, I mean
Ham
a
and
little
cheese.
yeah, exactly. And like I say, it's worth noting that we first see it here, and it may or may not develop down the road further depending on the episode. But and on the same breath, it's kind of a breath of fresh air because we've had such grim, we've had the tense balance of terror, and we've had Dagger of the Mind and the Conscience of the King, and so I think it's always good to throw a different pitch, not just your fastball, a change up, a slurve, a knuckleball.
An aptly named short leave, really.
So, exactly. So, in this case, I guess you could, we talk about foundational episodes, and I'll let Ursa and Uther speak to that in a moment. But this is a foundational episode, too, and they're saying your experience with this show is not just going to be enemy of the week, crisis of the week. We're gonna put you in maybe some unfamiliar and some challenging places, even if done so with a comedic lens, and see how that surprises you. And you have to think back to 1966 viewers. Like this thing, all of a sudden, we've got samurai warriors, we've got tigers, we've got World War II aircraft strafing from the skies. We've got a giant white rabbit and Alice. I mean, it's literally just kind of a smorgasbord, a menu of just absolute, what will they think of next? And so I kind of want to start there, gentlemen. I mean, it's something that any Trek episode can do, and I would be fascinated. I think Strange New Worlds did this with their medieval holodeck storyline in season 1 with Mabenga and his daughter, in the sense of just giving us sort of what the heck is going to come around the corner. But this is just, like I say, there's so many different ingredients they used to make this amusement park, the night, the jousting night. They really kind of just went and just sort of plucked these things in. And it's not Star Trek that we're familiar with up to this point. I guess, again, we have the benefit of hindsight, but this is different Trek. So how did it feel either upon your first viewing, if you saw this in your youth, or if this was, like for me, the very first time laying eyes on it? Like, how did that change of pace land?
I really enjoyed it. The first time I saw it, I don't think I got it. I think I was too young. But, we've had a couple of back-to-back Shakespearean episodes, and there's one thing that's truly Shakespearean, and that's a random punch of comedy to sort of break up the tension. this episode is definitely campy. I mean, it is ham and cheese at its finest. In that there's a lot of ham and cheese, and if you're a fan of sandwiches, you like a good thick sandwich. I think it was interesting going back to it now because I hadn't seen it. I don't know, 20 years, 25 years probably. And it's not one of those like remarkable episodes you remember for all time. Whereas I think a Galileo 7, the follow-up episode, is in more substance anyway. But it definitely is still a foundational Trek episode because it takes that sort of goofy, almost chop suey type episode where they kind of throw everything against the wall at once and hope that it makes something cogent. And it just sort of works. I mean, it sort of works in the strangest way. But it definitely feels like a game of dress up. You know, like they had some trunks from the back lot and they said, here, pick out a couple of costumes. We're going to throw it in there. We're going to put a yeoman in a princess garb, and we're going to have odd, you know, sexual tension between the doctor and make him kind of the ladies' man of the episode, which
Do not let
kind
that
of
go
doesn't play.
unpossessed. That made me slightly uncomfortable, and I think you guys should speak to that. In that DeForest Kelly, as we've always envisioned him, as kind of the crotchety but good-natured Southern doctor. But here, there was this overt attempt, you know, a leering gaze at the yeoman. He ends up with a pair of casino Rigel girls, you know.
Yeah.
This was a weird one for me. But how did that with McCoy? Please speak to
You
that.
want to talk about a curveball. I think, you know, because we remember Dr. McCoy, Southern gentleman, right? Always that was his character. And I think this is true to life in a way that maybe was unintentional, as I think no matter how gentlemanly the Southern men, red-blooded male, right? Into women, you know, that this was the era where this kind of thing sort of played, sort of made sense. It is a little uncomfortable because there probably wasn't a big age difference, but it certainly felt like there was. And there's definitely a rank difference, which I think certainly through a modern lens makes you feel uncomfortable. If you process it through the lens of the time, probably less so. But it's definitely odd. Like, it does not fit the character. Now, if it had been Kirk or Spock as a foil to Kirk, where it's like, oh, let's put Spock in this uncomfortable situation, plays great, right? But for the Doctor, it's just sort of like, what? Although I think it adds a layer to his character. Like, if you think of it from a meta-analysis, like, it humanizes him in a way where he's not just, damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a blank. You know, it's like, well, I'm a doctor, but I'm also, you know, a man. A man
I'd
with
like to
needs.
see you in that dress. Yeah, that's the
Right. It did feel real odd. But you also have to remember they're on a pleasure world. And
yeah.
in as much as they're on a pleasure world, like, think of yourself as an adult going to an amusement park. I've done it a couple of times with my kids, but you get on a roller coaster, right? And for a brief moment, as you're coming up that first hill and you crest over and go down, you're a kid again. You can't control yourself. You let out that scream. You throw up your arms. In that moment where you're in pure amusement mode, you sort of give into animal impulse. So there is something to be said about being in a situation where all of your dreams can come true. Literally any dream is on the table. And frankly, I think if you made this, say, on an HBO Star Trek series these days, it would be a very different episode and probably a little bit more lurid. This was probably as cheeky as they were going to ever get with Star Trek, but I think it is something that Star Trek does very well. It subtextually makes them more human. And especially for the Doctor, he's always going on about how Spock isn't human. You green-blooded this or that. You know, this is the Doctor being about as human as one can get. And that, again, it feels a little weird. And certainly from what we know of the Doctor going through the series, through the movies, like, this is not totally in line with his character, but it also kind of sets that Spock, Dr. McCoy, foil up for the rest of the series. So I think you have to look at it from that perspective. It does feel a little strange, but the whole episode feels a little strange, and it's odd. I won't deny that, but I kind of liked it. I have to say, I got a kick out of these characters getting their kicks. I mean, it was just pure sort of oddball fun, and it's again, this is something that I don't think later Trek episodes ever really broke. This kind of ground, maybe with Q somewhat, maybe in like Q Who or Cupid, but aside from the Q episodes of Next Generation, I don't really think you get like this pure, unadulterated, do whatever you want kind of fun episode, which is cool.
For this ham and cheese sandwich, let me take you back to 1983. There's this movie where this family is driving across country and they stop for a minute, and Clark reaches into the picnic basket and takes out the sandwich, and he's dancing with it, and he does this, and he takes a bite out of it, and his wife goes, "Clark, don't eat those. The dog peed on the picnic basket." That's kind of what this episode is like in terms of a ham sandwich with lots of cheese. It's like the dog just peed all over it. Look, anytime you have a 30-second laugh track, 30 seconds, it's not even a laugh track, where all the actors are like, it kept going. It was 30 seconds long at the end of the episode. It was just this whole thing. And anytime you have McCoy acting like Herbert from Family Guy, talking to the yeoman to, why don't you put on this,
me off too?
why don't you put on this dress? I mean, what? What? McCoy would never say something like that. So I can see how, the network was thinking this wasn't going to happen. I could see how Roddenberry felt he had to rewrite everything. And, to your point there.
And maybe that's where they lost the thread. Maybe in this frantic rewriting, they did stray from what the idea of the character was, just because they had to put something on the page so that they could go say the lines. I mean, you could chalk it up. I love Ursa's idea that this deepens his character to a degree, but it could have just been the fact that they're just in a rush to get this thing finished and turned in, after the mess apparently behind the scenes, that they may have just, like I say, they weren't sitting there tracking, okay, wait a minute, actors like to do that a lot. My character would never say that, or my character would never act against the interests of the crew. I mean, I'm saying it just may have been like, screw it, we're doing live.
Well, plus, it's still in its infancy, I think,
Right.
They were probably still kind of figuring out their characters, but to me, that was the most un-McCoy thing McCoy could ever do. Because I think he was always looked upon a little bit as a father figure in a sense, because he probably is a little bit older, but that to me, it didn't work. And then the laugh track at the end, there was even a scene where Finnegan punches Kirk, so he goes this way to punch him, so Kirk should have went that way. Kirk goes that way and falls down. Like, there was just all this goofy stuff going on. Kirk's, we got another episode where Kirk had a shirt partially off. The yeoman's shirt being ripped, that was weird too. I mean, this was just a hodgepodge of
hijinks.
Weird is the wrong word. Oddities that I don't think you would completely see in Star Trek. I felt like we saw it here. So, as you can already tell, this one's probably not going to get a lot of warp cores from me. And to your point there, Stefan, just one more point. I like the analogy or lining this up with the Strange New Worlds episode, because that was my least favorite episode of Strange New Worlds.
Interesting.
Was that one.
Oh, see, I liked that one quite a bit.
So
you
like it
just
grim.
felt like so far off the.
You
Not
like it,
grim. Look. This is to Urza's point, and we've talked about this too, especially with Spock. When you have to make the jokes so overtly out there, and this is what you're kind of saying too there, Stefan, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in Trek for me. It's got to be, like you said, it's got to be organic and play off of what the characters do. That's what's so beautiful. Like the line where Spock's like, "We have a crewman who, needs to have shore leave," and he lists off all those things, and Kirk's like, "Yeah, that guy's got to have shore leave. Who is he?" And he's like, "James T. Kirk." Perfect. Boom.
Yeah.
Something Spock would do. I can live with that little bit of funny there, but the rest of it was just so like over the. If I'm an Irishman, I'm offended by Finnegan. I mean, it was just.
Even more than
I'm
Riley.
not. I'm just making a joke, but like way off the charts. So I'm done rambling. This is not Phantom Menace-ish, but it goes down that path.
Ooh, spicy take from Lord Uther. Let's cut that.
we talked about how Ethan Peck does such a brilliant job of underplaying Spock in Strange New Worlds, and again, his comic lines and delivery feel very organic. Where there's a shot of, if I recall, when they're sitting at a table in the lounge, and then he gets up and walks over to two other crewmen and says, "I'm sorry you had to see that dreadful exchange."
It was so good.
Right. I mean, it's funny, it's clever, it's witty, and it doesn't necessarily call that overt attention to itself. I think part of this, I don't think the comic hijinks undercut the idea of menace, because I think if you're getting strafed by World War II aircraft or there's a tiger running around behind you, I'm sure you feel a sense of jeopardy. But too often in this show, at key points, they were using a very sprightly score, particularly with the Alice
Great point.
Wonderland, and I mean it would not have been out of place, and I'm not trying to point fingers, but it would not have felt out of place into something more like a Woody Allen early comedy, when he was doing Bananas and Sleeper, and it felt too like bubbly, I guess. And we talk about how music plays an important role in film and television. And so you're sort of calibrating an audience's expectations. And no television show still to this day has ever been able to manipulate an audience's mood and create an atmosphere and a sense of dread and tension better than Angelo Badalamenti's score for David Lynch's Twin Peaks. Like, there were certain musical themes in that show that when they came up, even before a line of dialogue had been spoken or the scene had changed locations or what have you, you knew that, okay, something bad is about to happen because of the musical choices I'm hearing, I'm familiar with. I know that Laura Palmer theme means trouble. Just as when I hear the Audrey Horne theme, like, it's okay, things might get a little strange right now. We might, go into the red room or... So music is important. And like I say, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's just, it sends out this very sort of la-di-da. And that kind of can undercut some of that tension that you're, I think, expected to feel. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong, in this chronological viewing of Trek, this is the first time one of the big three is killed. It probably won't be the last, but we've just got a character, McCoy, we were just lightly chiding for seeming a little ungentlemanly. He gets run through with a knight's lance. And again, we obviously in our hearts think, oh, they couldn't have killed McCoy. But for about 20 minutes or so, he's not on camera and people are reacting as if he's dead. So that's something to consider. Other quick things that thought, I know they were still workshopping all of this, and if I could go back and retcon it, I would have made this character Ruth perhaps Carol Marcus. I mean, there's no way that they had.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Right, that Carol Marcus. If the idea is to ground Kirk is, sure, I can have a fling of the week, but there was always that one that, and we ended up having a child, and like emotionally, I would have liked that to have, changed the name Ruth to Carol, and then suddenly you've got a whole different level of all of that. Isn't it funny how like the phasers, I don't know why I thought of this in this episode, because here they were just more used again as standard defense, but the phaser is a very important weapon. Like, you can use it as like a bomb to like try and blow up Kirk and the conscience of the king. You can, I mean, we just thought it was a ray gun, but it has a lot of punch apparently. And I just noted that it's more than just beyond a simple, like in the Star Wars universe, a blaster is a blaster. A cigar is a cigar. But the phaser apparently is like basically a small nuclear bomb in your hand, depending on what the writers needed to do at any given point. So that occurred to me. Uther mentioned the torn tunic. Again, any chance to get a little bit of Shatner's skin. And the fight scene, which you timed the laugh track. I think we should probably time that fight scene between him and Finnegan. Not since John Carpenter's They Live have we had a more extended mano a mano up and down and across and over and there's only a couple of moments in the high def where you can clearly pick out the stunt doubles, so you just have to look past that really quick because they are obvious stunt doubles. But I mean, the episode kind of comes a little bit to a halt just because the only thing of the fight scene is the fight scene. Like there's no other subtext we're kind of learning from it. At the end, Kirk's like, yeah, I loved kicking his butt. Like that was pretty much all it was. And we could have got there maybe a minute or two sooner. You almost got the feeling like Roddenberry's like, I'm done, I'm tired, just have him fight. Again, more. And I kept looking for the famous double-fisted. I didn't quite get that Kirk move. I got a lot of. He was kicking, he was flipping. He got in a couple of good right crosses, left hooks, but we didn't quite have that famous fight choreography that we all know and love. But it seemed to go on, sort of past the point, not to the point where you're like fast forwarding through the episode, but like, all right, I get it. Kirk needs to get this out of his system.
You're sitting there going, yeah, it's like, when is this going to end?
Right.
I mean,
right.
At what point are they going to stop
fighting? I think it extended over what would be considered a commercial break. Like, it kind of starts, and then they cut to a commercial or where a commercial would be inserted, and they come back, and he's still, like, fighting him. And that goes on for 2 or 3 more minutes, and you're like... So, plus there was a lot of running. And I just, Tom Cruise still gets...
Yes.
Tom Cruise still gets the if they ever did a battle of the network stars, he would still be the guy I pick for the relay based on all the running he does in his Mission Impossible franchise and so forth. But yeah, there's a lot of like, all right, let's put Shatner out there and run. And then there was more like, all right, and now let's have him and McCoy. I mean, McCoy was more of a heavy jog, but still run. So, I thought it's very funny. When you can tell it's not a stunt double, and Shatner's like, again, and he's like, yeah, back to 1, Bill. Let's just get this. We didn't quite get that there, but he did a lot of cardio in this episode, and so it was noteworthy. We'll sound off on our ratings in a little bit on it, but I think we can agree that it definitely broke an early mold and so forth, and it's not quite the most egregious view of this. To Uther's point, that laugh track that you heard of, I mean, that was almost a staple of ending Buck Rogers episodes. You won't believe how many times they were like sit around at the end of a mission and be like, oh, well, I'm glad Tweaky wasn't there. I mean, it became almost a cliche, if you will.
Awful.
Yeah.
I guess you could say it was a bit of a sticky situation.
Executive producer Glenn Larson. So, anyways, so we'll move on from the hijinks and hilarity of Shore Leave into the Galileo 7. Galileo, which was our very first episode in
Galileo.
In 1967. January 5th, in fact. So we've all had our New Year's celebration. We're deeply more engaged in conflict in Southeast Asia. And I am only 5 years away from being born. So that's something to look forward to for now. Galileo 7.
Mark your calendars.
Yes. Was directed by Robert Gist. He was an actor who appeared in front of the camera. He was a director. He became an acting coach, which I think is an interesting career path, so forth. So he really came at this, and I think the episode reflects that. He really came at this from a performance-forward piece that's kind of where his bread and butter was. And he was an acting coach, again, subsequently following his Trek work. But I think that's where his heart always lay, and he, like I say, became quite a distinguished teacher, if you will. The story was by Oliver Crawford, meaning he came up with the original concept and probably did a couple of early drafts. And then he shared writing credit with S. Bar David, which was the pseudonym for Simon Winselberg. We've already seen S. Bar David, aka Simon Winselberg, in Dagger of the Mind, which he scripted. Crawford, though, he was a blacklisted writer during the Joseph McCarthy era. And go ahead and Google that, youngsters, if you weren't familiar with that period in which Hollywood was accused of being filled with leftist pinkos and communists. And as a result, several of them were not allowed to officially work for the major studios or television. They were basically frozen out of their careers. And so some of them, flipped and testified against fellow writers in order to have these privileges restored, and they were later shunned by the community. Others used pseudonyms, and it's a complicated and messy part of Hollywood history, but it deserves your time and research if you do it. But Oliver Crawford was one of those who was kept off, blacklisted during that time. This is the debut of the Enterprise shuttlecraft, and the enhanced digital effects make it look terrific. In fact, indistinguishable from Next Generation or DS9 or any of the shows that came later, as you'd expect. I'm kind of curious what the original 1967 effects might have looked like. Hopefully there's a bootleg out there somewhere you can see that.
Or just an official CBS VHS copy.
There you go. That's there. As well as some other Don Marshall as Lieutenant Boma, and John Crawford as Commissioner Ferris, whom I have to say, he's a bit of a lurker, because it appears his principal job this episode is just to kind of lean on bridge equipment and stations and argue with Kirk over it's time to go. And I mean...
And keeping time.
Right.
He's the timekeeper.
The timekeeper, right. Like a FIFA official. But I just felt like how at ease he was at like leaning up against Uhura when she's trying to do her communications work, or leaning over the chair when Kirk is trying to issue, like, he was just a lurker, right? And the actor Crawford, don't want to face shame him, but, he kind of had a countenance and demeanor that suggested he was not the life of the party and would not have enjoyed himself on the shore leaf planet, one can suspect. He was a gloomy Gus, sort of a killjoy, if you will. And you could see Captain Kirk's impatience at being constantly reminded, yes, I get it, there's a war going on, but darn it, my crew is out there. So I enjoyed that. I'm a fan of quasars. Quasars are one of those 1970s science fiction astronomy terms that they taught us, like black holes. But I think black holes have much better agents. And so we hear a lot about black holes and wormholes and things like that. We don't get enough quasar talk. It's sort of diminished and pushed back in line. But darn it, give me a good quasar. And this one, again, digitally enhanced in a brilliant emerald green. So I was very excited, even if all I was looking at was a static special effect at the green quasar. That truly made me excited. We did get the Galileo shuttle. It does not resemble Star Trek shuttles as we have grown accustomed to in the Rick Berman and the later years. There was a lot of legroom, surprisingly, in the Galileo, so forth. And it made me think: is there also, because we had I think we had a Columbus too. Was there a Magellan, a Vasco da Gama? Were there, all sorts of? I would have been some really nice to go down the line and see how many shuttles were named after colonists and so forth. So This one had, my note says Spock versus McCoy banter. And again, it's not the first time these two have traded it, whether in jest or in crisis. But I think it's a good representative where McCoy is challenging Spock's human to Vulcan empathy and so forth. And I think that's where the discussion for Galileo needs to begin is, and we talked about performance, coming from the director. Like, this is a Nimoy showcase, despite having 6 other cast members to deal with, because for the first time, really, here's Spock put in that situation of leadership, and how does his persona qualify or disqualify him from those decisions? And regardless of everything that's going on all around him, a lot of distraction and chafe and so forth, and we'll get to that shortly, we get to see this character sort of, again, under duress. He doesn't have Captain Kirk there to lean on to, help him, either agree with his decision making or contradict him and so forth. This Spock's out on a limb, and the choices that he makes in this episode and for this crew, I actually think some of the writing sort of undercuts that in a way, because they have a dilemma, a classic Trek dilemma. We can't lift off, we're too heavy. We'll have to leave some people behind. And that, as we'll talk about that as a choice, is pretty powerful. However, they kind of get let off the hook with the demise of said crewman, which then we didn't have to make that hard choice. And again, I know they're not doing this just to undercut their own messaging, but imagine if the crew had survived long enough that a choice had to be made. And this episode asks, well, what are we going to do? Draw straws? Let's talk about Spock as a character. Let's talk about what this episode taught us about Spock, again, chronologically. He goes from being this, second banana in this one to in the driver's seat, metaphorically and literally. And like I say, this is a breakout moment for the character and for Leonard Nimoy in a lot of ways. Ursa.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting portrait of Spock, right? And it's kind of amazing that this happened in season 1. Because up until this point, you think of Spock almost as this mythical figure who's kind of always right. His logic is flawless, and really hasn't made a mistake. And yet, this stoic, inhuman, half-human gets into classic human debacles. And, kind of proves himself as the science officer, proves himself as a second in command. Not necessarily in a bad right, but shows that he too is flawed. He's humanized in this episode. It's really just different. Kind of like the last episode, it's almost out of character, the choices he makes, but at the same time, it deepens him. It kind of makes him more than one dimension, and that's where I think the uniqueness of Spock's later characterization comes from, and how he he's almost impulsive in a way. Like he acts. I think of Star Trek V, where he kind of just throws Kirk into the mix here. We have to do this, and okay. Or Star Trek VI, you have to do this, we have to resolve this thing with my brother. We have to resolve this thing with the Klingons. I have to somehow save this crew, but at the same time, I don't want to just kill these ape people. It's almost too easy. Like he's making illogical moves, right? I mean, the logical thing would be we have to fight these off. Let's use lethal force because that'll be, a significant deterrent. No, we're just going to try and scare them, which, may be a nicer way of doing things, but certainly logically doesn't make sense, right? So, in my mind, he's acting in ways that kind of run against his character, but also he is half human. And I think that is, to this point, kind of lost. Like, you don't really get that half human part of him too much. And I think it's the beauty of this episode that it sort of exposes the fact that while he may be Kirk's logic, he's not necessarily without, any kind of, flaws or emotion all his own. Although he may only admit to being stubborn, which, again, laugh track. So I enjoyed it for that side of things. I enjoyed that it had the courage to sort of break with the Kirk-heavy, Kirk-driven episode. Obviously, we still get plenty of Kirk, but this is really a Spock story, and it shows that Star Trek can do more than the formulaic type, crisis of the week. Last episode notwithstanding, of course, that's a separate issue, of course, but it's pushing boundaries already, and it's we're talking not even quite midway through season 1. I think that's, again, when we talk foundational episodes, this is sort of foundational too, in that it shows that Trek is unafraid to try new things, to go in new directions, and to explore new situations. Not just strange new worlds, not just new civilizations, but new leadership, new character flaws that may or may not be addressed in some way, shape, or fashion going forward. So that to me is one of the most interesting parts of this episode.
A planet full of these giants makes me a little a little nervous. See, but Spock. Okay, so he says a line when they're on the ship, and he's on the Galileo, and he goes, "I don't get it. I've made every logical decision, and we're basically gonna die." And I thought that was very telling that he had said that line. And I think the other part of this episode was to kind of show that the logical choices don't always win the day, in a sense. And then he goes with his instinct, and he decides that he's going to blaze a trail across the sky, and it winds up working, right? Not necessarily logical because he burns up all their fuel, but it winds up saving the day. And I think McCoy even says, like, you went with your gut or something like that. You went with your instinct to try it and didn't consult anyone, just did it. I agree with Stefan here. I would have liked to have seen Spock make the logical decision, because it probably would have been, I'm leaving the 2 lowest ranks behind because I need to be on the ship and they need the chief doc, right? I mean, to me, that would have been the logical choice. And what is it with lower ranking people on this ship questioning Spock all the time, or basically making all these anti-Vulcan comments to him?
It's a shame.
Nonstop. How are these guys not broken down in rank for what they're doing and speaking to a superior officer like that? They never get in trouble. I think that's kind of...
Insubordination is rife on the Enterprise. It's crazy.
Seriously. I mean, they're always going after this poor guy.
And he takes it stoically. He's not like the guy, what did you say, Ensign? I'll count.
Right. Which is kind of cool because it plays into the logic, right? Don't give in to this kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. And, again, to Stefan's incredible points, which he always brings here on Pending Rebrand. So if you would click subscribe because you want to hear more of what Stefan has to say, just click that like button, click that subscribe button. Share us with your friends. Join the millions.
And millions.
And millions.
Of Pending Rebrand fans out there. Anyway, phasers. They can fill up the fuel on an entire shuttle. These things, it's like they should have an infomercial for phasers. Get yourself a phaser today. Not only can you stun people, you can kill them, and you can recharge a Galileo shuttle with it.
It can be used as an explosive device. It's a
right.
Yes, I think that's what
the possibilities are endless.
Indeed. I love seeing Scotty working behind the scenes to get everything and trying different tricks. Although they used a classic screwdriver. This is just like the spray bottle in Conscience of the King. I mean, couldn't you have thrown on some decal or something to make me think it was a space tool? But no, it was hand me the Phillips head, which Miss Spock graciously did. I won't make the joke I was going to make about the creatures. I'll just allude to a 1988 Sigourney Weaver drama, and if you want to Google that, you'll get where the joke is going, where I would have gone with it, but good taste prevents me from. I will say though that I love Ground Fog. It just has that old school horror movie on the moors. You know, it's not actual fog, which would be at eye level or better, but it's ground fog. So only your ankles are covered as you're moving through, and I love it. And if it happens in real life, I'm there. So give me more ground fog and mist. The McCoy with a phaser.
Speaking of,
Go ahead.
I got to jump in just one more time here. All this insubordination, and this guy who's being told you're going to stay here, and if you see any more of these giants, like yell for help or run back to the ship. Isn't that the point, that you're insubordinate and you're like, they just killed one of our guys, I'm not staying here? Like, you should be insubordinate at that point,
Yes.
not, questioning Spock's loyalties or his heritage or whatever it is. Like, that's the point. You're saying, no, Mr. Spock, I'm not staying here by myself, or you can stay here, I'll go back to the shuttle. We all knew what was going to happen.
To quote the great Steven Seagal from 1992's Under Siege, that's not assaulting an officer, thwack. That's assaulting an officer. So anyways, McCoy with the phaser,
Wonderful.
Again, he doesn't use it, but he's told to give it up so Scotty can recharge the shuttle. So that, obviously, you would probably issue sidearms if you're on a landing party and so forth. I get it, but it's still jarring to see a man of healing basically armed. Like I say, it struck me as incongruous there for a moment, just to think that McCoy, that he might not say, I don't need one of those, et cetera, but they did it. And no amount of digital effects, and there were some quite good ones here with the shuttlecraft burning off its fuel and the quasar and so forth. But they really should have worked on the spear throwing, because my suspension of disbelief was suspended as these large, presumably heavy spears went clunk and then clunk again. Like there was, the less said I better on 1967 fight choreography, where as far as that came, but it still is a little bit of a eye roll in terms of how that one played there. So. But, you get a ticking clock, literally, with the commissioner, a.k.a. the timekeeper. The Enterprise does leave orbit, albeit at a glacial pace, in order to, quote, buy some more time. You see Kirk doing every last trick in the book. If they'd had a direct communication with Starfleet, he might have tried the old communications are mangled trick. You're breaking up, Starfleet. What was that? I can't read you. We're in a quasar. But we thankfully never got to that moment. But there is a sense at the end, like, how are they going to get out of this kind of a thing? So I just think, from my own perspective, it's like we don't have enough food in the lifeboat, or the lifeboat is sinking, and we have to get rid of one of you as ballast. Which is the one is it going to be? That's just drama 101. And I think we don't get to spend nearly enough time marinating with that, and what Spock's choice may have come down to. Sacrificing himself, even though he's valuable to the ship and the crew and everything, to say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. You could have gone that direction, or to Uther's point, just, hey, last hired, first, to be left behind on the planet. You could have done that and had them freak out, like, wait, what? I just joined last month, and you're going to strand me on a world of where apes have evolved from men? But I just think they were like, oh, okay, well, we'll kill a couple off, and then suddenly all you have to do is dump the science equipment, and we're golden. So, but again, Montgomery Scott fixing things, Spock and McCoy arguing about things. These are ingredients that every good Trek episode deserves. and we definitely get that here with the Galileo 7. So that's where I would come down there.
And I think that's a great segue into rating these two episodes. Obviously, I think we've had some mixed feelings about both. So maybe these aren't going to get those perfect 7 warp cores, but I'm anxious to hear what Lord Uther has to say about Shore Leave and the Galileo 7.
Shore Leave, eject the warp core, blow it up. It's just I mean, I'll leave it at that. 3 out of 7 for Shore Leave. I don't even know what the saving grace is of that episode, quite frankly. Maybe it's seeing William Shatner with his shirt off again. I have no idea, but I can't. Sulu firing a gun. I mean, I can't. 3 out of 7 is probably too generous. Galileo 7. I'm gonna go 6 out of 7. It's not the perfect episode. I do like when Spock questions himself. It's part of his growth, and we even see that on Strange New Worlds where he's making mistakes. That's actually, to me, one of the great things about Strange New Worlds is we're seeing Spock turn into that confident, logical leader. But we kind of see a little bit of his, error in his ways with this episode. Again, the questioning all the time, maybe that's what bothered me. I just don't get why they're always going after Spock. And the timekeeper was a little annoying, but I know what his purpose was there. So 6 out of 7 warp cores. Plus the dramatics of their burning up in orbit, and everyone's like, it's hot in here. Yeah, of course it's hot. You're burning up in the atmosphere, and you're about to die. And obviously someone sprayed your face with water because you're sweating like that and you're going down. So, I mean, no one's concerned. It's like, oh, yeah, we're burning up. It's hot in here. Yeah, all right. So, anyway, 6 out of 7. So, Stefan, I'm going to throw it over to you and get your thoughts.
Well, I was prepared with Shore Leave to take it slightly below the usual range, but I'm not quite prepared to eject warp cores and so forth. I understand a lot of intent, and speaking from a writing perspective, I understand that this particular episode had some unique production challenges in the moment. So I have a little more grace to offer this one. I still think it has some tonal and character dissonance, but I also like the just, as it might have been when you finally read what pages they turned in. What do you mean there's a samurai? What do you mean there's a tiger? And actually, it should be pointed out, they even had an elephant waiting on standby that they never got to use. And that became a joke at later Star Trek conventions. When are you going to use the elephant? For those fans in the room that really know too much about how this show was made and how the sausage was created. But I'm going to go with a 5 on Shore Leave. I think it falls short, perhaps, of an absolute pinnacle Trek, top Trek, peak Trek. But I think they deserve points for trying, and I think they should go back and rescore some of it to make it a little less zany. Again, I like a good bouncy score, but I just think that this one actually, when it calls attention to itself in such a forward way, it runs the risk of being grating. And there were a couple of moments that my teeth were on edge when I heard it. Galileo 7, I think for its potential, really, like what could have been and what we do get with Spock, I think it deserves a 6. Again, I'm not giving any 7 to an episode with the ape creatures that throw paper mache spears with such a lack of good arm strength or what have you. Like that's not happening. But again, the psychological ramifications of having to make tough command choices and having to choose between going through the intellect or the gut, and while having a crew that's basically every 5 seconds, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this, Mr. Spock? What are you going to do? Like, to have to do all that with them constantly, it's a wonder he didn't just turn around and snap all of you outside now. You know, go stand under that tree. I need to think. So, and Scotty, meanwhile, is just dutifully hand me that screwdriver because we got to get this thing off the ground. So we'll give it a 6 there. And the green quasar definitely helps boost this score there. So more quasars, people. Black holes are overrated. Let's have more quasars.
Yes, quasars are always good. Shortly for me, I enjoy the camp. I have to say it was different. It was odd. Definitely some character dissonance, but I had fun. I had fun watching it, and that's something that I think, especially in the Star Trek movies, gets played up. Like the fun of Star Trek. You know, there are certain things that are just sort of goofy and unusual, and we'll see this in later episodes. I'm thinking of a certain fuzzy episode that comes up not only once in Star Trek the original series, but also in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And there's a lot of that in this episode, and it's just one of those, let's break up the tension with something off the wall and strange. So that being said, it is also a little much. It's a little drawn out. There's a lot of running. The fight scene was way too long. I think the whole airplane thing was also, like, it didn't do it for me. But I enjoyed myself, and I have to give it to him for that. So I do think with a meta-analysis, I appreciate it more. So I think I would have originally gone with a 4 out of 7, but I'm going to give it a 5 out of 7. Only because I think it informs later humorous aspects, especially my favorite Star Trek 4. And they lean into that parts of the character a little bit here and there, which endears it to me. The Galileo 7, I have to give a 6 out of 7 too, because of Spock, and the dislogic of his logic, and the play in the half-human aspect of things, how he fervently denies that he's gone with his gut, but will admit to being stubborn, and sort of the cheeky, like, you caught me, but I'm not going to let you have it. And the fact that they had the courage to do something largely without Kirk. Not to say that Kirk didn't, obviously have his role and play his part, but this was really the first time that Star Trek did something that was rest of the crew centric. And in the terms of the movies, which we've already gone through, I kind of wish we would have gotten that a little bit more in one of the original series movies. Even though a couple of them were driven by Spock more so than the other characters, they were very Kirk focused. Kirk finding Spock, Kirk facing off against Khan. Motion picture, I think you got to throw out because it really didn't have a great cogent storyline. But Voyage Home, very Kirk. Final Frontier even is very heavily Kirk, despite the fact it's Spock and Sybok are really driving that story. But and then of course Star Trek 6 is all Kirk. Even Generations, is got a lot of Kirk to it. I would have loved to have seen a Let's Go Save Kirk episode where the rest of the crew has to step up. Although you got a little bit of that in Voyage Home with Chekhov and Uhura going to find the nuclear vessels, but I have to say I love that aspect of it. I wish we got more of that, and unfortunately, time is our enemy. They say that time is the fire in which we burn. And with that, I will leave you all with a live long and prosper.